Welcome to Piecemeal, a podcast hosted by the Emily Program. Piecemeal covers topics related to eating disorders, body image, and how society may influence our thinking. Please use your discretion when listening and speak with a therapist as needed. I'm your host, Jillian Lampert. I'm really excited about our guest today because, you'll hear all the reasons I'm excited, but I'm excited to have Rawnaq join us and share her journey navigating an eating disorder, and also talk a little bit about her career that she's in the middle of pursuing, and how those two things might connect, and what she'd like to see in terms of support for other people struggling with an eating disorder. And so I think I'll leave it at that. I'm super excited you're here. Welcome to Piecemeal.
Thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome. Let's start with a little bit just background. So let's set the stage. We're going to be talking about kind of an array of times through life. So maybe just start by telling us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, so I was born in Yemen, but I grew up in Dubai for 11 years of my life in a very perfectionistic school culture. I was in a very strict private school that cared about nothing but grades and GPAs. And for example, I was taking biology in third grade, chemistry in fourth, physics in fifth. And I had extreme anxiety about my grades and succeeding. Even for kindergarten, I had to take a test to even get in. In 2016, I moved to Virginia with my family. So immigrating here, having to assimilate to Western culture was definitely hard and started to give me that feel of having lost control. The culture is different, language, tradition, and especially school expectations were also different. I am now a senior at the University of Arizona, majoring in dietetics and pursuing a weight inclusive certificate, which I'm so thankful for the program coordinators, Ashley Carrillo and Caitlin Barker, for making it happen. And it's been absolutely incredible and very insightful to be a part of it. And it's also open for dietitians and health professionals to take as well. So that's really cool. I'm also the co-president of Everybody Arizona, a weight inclusive club that spreads awareness about eating disorders and weight stigma. And I start my graduate school this summer and hopefully will be a dietitian in a couple of years.
That's so fantastic. Thank you for that overview. I have so many questions just based on what you just shared. But tell us a little bit about, you have a personal experience of an eating disorder. Tell us a little bit about when the eating disorder started. Where were you in life then? And how did it sort of play out in your life in the sort of early stages of the eating disorder?
Yeah, so a couple of key events, I'd say. My mom growing up was, I don't know if you've heard the term of almond mom before my eating disorder developed. So everything had to be like baked, fat-free, seasonings had to be organic. She'd compete with some of her friends over who fed their kids the healthiest. It was very unhealthy. I also had a really toxic health teacher in middle school who'd say the most fat-phobic statements, ask us to record what we ate for the class to judge. And I was already like a health freak because of the messages I was receiving, but I didn't really care about my weight back then. I just wanted to be healthy, whatever that means. And then between again, as an immigrant, between not being able to fully assimilate and full feeling lost in my culture and religion, and there was some bullying I received in middle school as well. My eating disorder had a great purpose to serve and came at the perfect time in middle school. I felt like I finally had something to look forward to, something euphoric, something to calm me down and regulate me. And I didn't even fully know what an eating disorder was back then. I mean, I was 13, and they definitely did not teach us about them when I was in school. So that's kind of an overview of how it started.
That makes sense. And I often hear in people's stories that element of the eating disorder provided this sort of sense of predictability or
Yeah.
expectation, even if it wasn't pleasant, even if it wasn't an experience that you'd really want to have, at least you knew what to expect, which in some ways is fascinating from a brain science perspective, right? We know from the brain science around eating disorders that some of us, myself included, who have a personal experience of an eating disorder, we very likely have a genetic predisposition that puts us at risk for an eating disorder when we change the way we eat, often, to your point, in response to diet culture and expectations around eating and healthy eating, quote unquote, and all of those things, that sense of expectation and predictability, which we can sometimes call control, is sort of a side effect of the change in eating that feels can feel super rewarding, or at least super predictable, right? Or sort of welcoming in its predictability. And so I often think when I work with clients, over the past 30 years that I've been a dietitian, it might be kind of miserable, but at least it's predictable, and that has some sort of peace in it, which makes it's part of kind of what makes recovery hard, right? Because you're giving up this like terrible thing that's making all kinds of things terrible in your life, and not and putting your health at great risk. And it's hard because then things become unpredictable, and the unknown is kind of boils down to the unknown is scary, isn't it? Particularly in a world with so much messaging around what we should do and look like, and all of that. And then it sounds, as I hear your story, that that component of the sort of cultural assimilation and sort of wanting to fit in, and like all teenagers want to fit in, right? Like that's just part of the work of adolescence. But to have that additional sort of facet of development is, I imagine, added an element for you. So you start to have this eating disorder, you're having these eating behaviors. What happens then? Like, take us down the path. How did your eating disorder evolve? How did your recovery journey start and evolve? And then tell us a little bit about that. And then I'm curious about what you found helpful and what you found really unhelpful in that process.
Well, eventually it got really bad, and my parents had to send me to adolescent eating disorder treatment at the Emily program, which was honestly life-changing. I met some amazing people, had a great team, and I felt like I could finally escape the triggering environment I was in. But I briefly stepped down to PHP before my treatment was interrupted by a family travel. And that caused me to be in a cycle of relapse and recovery for 9 years. When I traveled, it was out of the country. And so I went from having this full support of a team of a therapist, dietitian, psychiatrist, a doctor, to having absolutely nothing in a different country right after I just finished residential treatment. So it was definitely a shift. And this caused the cycle of recovery and relapse. And I have since been to the Emily program again twice. And I think the biggest barrier that I kept facing was that cultural and religious piece. Treatment centers are usually white centric, and trying to find a way to recover in while honoring my culture and religion was a little tricky. For example, Ramadan is a holy month where Muslims fast from sunrise to sunset for a month, which obviously I can't participate in due to the eating disorder, but learning how to navigate that is never a thing talked about in treatment centers. Even the difference in my culture around eating, where we eat two main meals and snacks throughout the day, is different from the Western way of eating 3 meals and 2 to 3 snacks a day. So being able to translate that from treatment to my home was also difficult to explore and navigate while trying to meet my nutritional needs, but also my values. With that being said, I do wish that I had extra support surrounding my culture in treatment. I also wish that treatment was more accessible to people, especially minorities. For example, I'm on Medicaid, and being able to find a treatment center that would take my insurance was extremely challenging. But thankfully, to the Emily program, I was able to help. They were able to help with that in my case, where I definitely feel like I got lucky. But many millions of people with eating disorders, especially minorities, like people of color and the queer community, for example, find it very challenging to access treatment, whether it's due to financial strains or the white centric and Western way of treatment that's usually offered. So I definitely feel like I wish there was more support and understanding around that when I was in eating disorder treatment.
That makes a ton of sense. We just had our Eating Disorders Coalition Advocacy Day in DC, and I was talking with some of the policy makers and legislators there around the barriers that people face getting care, right? There are unfortunately many, as you highlighted so beautifully, a few of them, but the Medicaid is an example, is most people don't realize how much the state influences what Medicaid covers and which part is federally influenced, and then what part is federally funded and which part is state funded. And then you have sort of two sets of policymakers contributing to, oh, this is an oversimplification, but sort of contributing to the rules and to the coverage pieces of it. So it can be so difficult to navigate a really pretty complex system in the first place, much less if you have any other barriers, which lots of people do, to access care. So I'm so glad that you were able to get care, and I really want to acknowledge that so many people are not able to get care because our healthcare system is not set up for even everybody with insurance to have equitable access to care, much less people who don't have insurance. So it's certainly something that we try to contribute to in terms of the work that we do at the Emily program to try to make a difference there. And it's a long road and a slow road of progress, but I'm glad that we are continuing to work at it and make some progress. But you're right, it can be such a barrier and definitely leaves people trying to get care in a situation where often they feel like, okay, if it's not getting covered or if people are telling me I can't get access, then maybe I don't need it. Did you ever experience that feeling of like, wow, this is hard to get and not quite the right fit for me? Did the eating disorder ever try to sort of swirl that around in your brain and convince you that maybe it just wasn't the right, maybe you didn't need that care or that wasn't where you needed to be? Did that happen at all for you?
Yeah, absolutely. It was more like you don't need the care, maybe you're not sick enough. There's a lot of the sick enough talk, and just having the whole process being frustrating. It just felt like, what is the point anymore? So yeah, it absolutely happens.
Yeah. Yeah. What did you have in terms of support and what did you find did help you to move along in your recovery? What were some of the sort of the highlights that were really helpful?
My treatment team was amazing every time I went to treatment. And my last day in treatment, I actually had a psychiatrist who was from the same religion and culture that I was. And so being able to explore some of the things as much as she was able to was very helpful. Having, the BHTs and just the whole team being accessible to us was very helpful. And structure was really helpful, the times of meals and that kind of switched my entire routine to be able to incorporate food more into my life. But yeah, those were definitely some of the more helpful things that I was able to engage in and receive through treatment.
That's wonderful. It does sort of highlight some of those core elements of treatment that can be tough, right? Having the structure of those meals and snacks can be difficult. As usually experienced as a more difficult part of the day. I know when I talk to people about eating disorders and folks that don't quite know much about eating disorders and are curious about them, often in the conversation it comes up around food and eating and people will often say something pretty reductionistic like, well, why don't they just eat? Or why can't they just do that? And not quite realizing that eating disorders are not really about food, but they sure are about food when food comes up and when food is around 3, 4, 5, 6 times a day, then that food piece is very much part of the eating disorder. And let's sort of pivot into that area. I know you're really passionate about nutrition, helping people improve their nutritional health as part of their eating disorder recovery. So let's talk a little bit about in your dietetics education, what sorts of barriers or misconceptions have you seen so far in the world of nutrition from your lens as the person you are and the experiences that you have had?
Yeah, I love this question. As a dietetic major, I've been exposed to many barriers and misconceptions in the world of nutrition when it comes to eating disorder recovery. I'm going to focus on three main ones. So, the first one, I hear this a lot, is that you're either in recovery or relapse. There's no in between, which is a super misleading way to understand eating disorder recovery because real recovery is rarely binary, and treating it that way can do more harm than good. So, eating disorder recovery isn't like flipping a switch. It's much closer to a spectrum where thoughts, behaviors, and coping skills shift over time. If someone, let's say, eats regularly but still has eating disorder thoughts, or they have a tough day and use some behaviors, or they slip into an old behavior but stop sooner than before, that doesn't mean that they're suddenly in relapse. They're in the messy middle, what I like to call it, which is actually where most recovery happens. And that binary idea really ignores a lot of things like how habits change gradually, how thoughts often lag behind behaviors, how progress includes setbacks. And that in between area can look like harm reduction for many people, which is actually life saving if you think about it, because for many, especially again, marginalized populations who can't access or don't feel like they fit in eating disorder centers, recovery can feel very inaccessible for these communities. And so harm reduction and quasi recovery may be their only way of getting some of their lives back. when we look at treatment centers, there's always this push for full recovery, a very one size fits all approach sometimes. And that includes full weight restoration, full abstinence from behaviors and such. And that constant push in such a short amount of time can and sometimes may actually do more harm than good, especially when other coping skills aren't worked on. So it's really essential to meet clients kind of in the middle and find what works best for them, what they truly want, what the most trauma-informed and culturally appropriate approach to treatment is, because for many, their eating disorders might not only be a reason they've survived for this long, it might have been their savior during some of the worst times of their life. So that's a big misconception that I always see. Another one is that the goal of recovery is always intuitive eating. And that's when you eat when you're hungry and stop when you're full. And that's a huge misconception because intuitive eating is an entire framework based on 10 principles. I took an intuitive eating class in college and it took us 7 weeks to dissect each and every principle. And that was an accelerated class. So it was supposed to be 16 weeks. And I'm only saying this to show how much more deep and complex intuitive eating is and how it's actually not appropriate or accessible to a lot of people, like neurodivergent individuals with sensory issues, underserved populations who might not always have food in handy to practice the framework. And it can be very hard for people in eating disorder recovery as well, especially if their hunger and fullness cues aren't fully back yet. And then one more barrier misconception that I always hear is that eating disorders and food are not political. And I'll start my rebuttal to this one with a quote from one of my favorite eating disorder harm reduction advocates on Instagram. Her account's name is Nalgona Pride or Nalgona Positivity. And she says eating disorders are colonial processes, they are unclaimed grievances, and they can be seen as the manifestation of a soul level hunger created by the loss of tradition, rites of passage, especially in societies impacted by colonization. And so she expands on how eating disorders are socially and politically constructed sometimes, and that they're not only about brain and or gut disorders because they can result from settler disordered culture, which is why we don't tend to find the most effective prevention in eating disorder in treatment for eating disorders in settler paradigms, and how the industry focuses on its own legitimacy while disavowing the inherent roots of collective eating, dysfunctionality, and forced starvation, like we currently see right now in Gaza, Congo, Sudan, Yemen, and more. So we really need to look and acknowledge how eating disorders are not just individual medical conditions, but as they've been shaped by history, culture, and power, this whole colonial disruption and soul level hunger that she describes explains how these genocidal disruptions can result in destruction of traditional food systems, banning or erasure of cultural practices and rites of passage, the imposition of mainstream treatment and Western beauty and body ideals, and the grief that hasn't been collectively processed. And mainstream treatment models that we have set up right now sometimes only focus on symptom reduction, like I mentioned, weight restoration and stopping behaviors, and they operate within insurance and medical frameworks, like we've discussed, and they emphasize individual recovery without addressing structural context. So they ignore cultural specificity, they overlook food insecurity or systemic oppression, and they pathologize individuals without naming harmful environments. Her point about food starvation highlights the spectrum, where on one end you have individualized restriction, and which is often medicalized, and on the other hand you have structural deprivation, which is often politicized or ignored, but both exist within the same system. So what do we do about all of this, you may ask? And I think, well, we need to move in a more holistic approach where we expand beyond settler and Western paradigms by including culturally rooted healing practices, community-based care instead of purely individual treatment, rebuilding relationships with food through tradition and land, addressing food access and sobriety, and acknowledging historical and intergenerational trauma. This doesn't replace medical or psychological care at all. It just adds layers that make recovery more meaningful and sustainable for many people. But yeah, that's often a misconception that I hear a lot, and has got me thinking recently in my recovery. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that you give a lot of voice to the depth of our experience with food as people and as the role that food plays in cultures varies by culture, but and also has this commonality across cultures of being a joining force, right? A sharing collective joining force. And that this is my own sort of theoretical musings about it, that when that when the society gets influenced in all the ways that it does, and that sort of fabric gets disrupted of connection through food, whether that fabric is disrupted through food insecurity or war or colonization or Medicaid coverage or whatever it is, right? That leads to a disruption in that fabric. Not only does it impact that person, but that person then is trying to recover from this illness in the midst of that fabric, which to your point can be really complex. So I appreciate your perspectives on the complexity of all of that, and then the system in which we are operating as a healthcare system. I know that I speak for all, thousands of providers, that I know that this probably wouldn't exactly be the way we would have set up a system to care for people with eating disorders in this checkbox sort of way that often treatment can be sort of pressured to be by outside forces, and that the focus on what does this individual need in the context of their particular fabric and their particular community of support is a really important question, and sometimes can be hard to hold all of that and deliver upon that for individuals in this framework of the way we do healthcare. So I appreciate your thoughts on how that leads to misconceptions in eating disorders, and also leads to difficulties in providing care or receiving care or accessing care. But it is certainly a much more complex problem. And even on a much more simplistic note, I often will tell people, like, I don't know why people are ever surprised that people get eating disorders. We're obsessed with food and appearance, and not obsessed with being able to cope with the world well. And so those things will get disrupted. So it's not terribly surprising that food becomes a component of that disruption, right? So, how a couple of questions. One, I'm really curious as you think about your interest in this area from a professional perspective, and it is getting the degree you're getting in nutrition now, and the master's degree you'll get, and the dietetic internship that you'll do, and the dietitian that you'll become. How has your personal experience with an eating disorder kind of combined with your professional path? How has your recovery evolved in the midst of that as your life has evolved?
Well, my recovery has evolved a lot and continues to evolve. When I was first introduced to recovery at 13, I thought that recovery was this utopia full of unicorns and rainbows, and it was all about eating and what I wanted, when I wanted, and needing to love my body. But after many relapses, I started to lose hope. And I was always confused by how perfect recovery seemed for other people on social media who tend to never share the actual reality and the messiness of recovery. So for years, I thought it was about being perfect, but on a different spectrum. And when I decided to go into nutrition around 17, I chose my major feeling like a fraud. I always thought, how am I going to help others when I can't even help myself? In my sophomore year of college, I went back to treatment at the Emily program, and that's when I started to think I really need to get myself together. And I was so determined to be fully in recovery, or even recovered, whatever that means, in 2 years by the time I graduate. And I had this strict deadline. I thought I was running out of time and needed to really be in recovery, not because I wanted to, but because I thought I had to if I ever wanted to be in the nutrition field. I even made a 2-year contract for myself and got tons of staff and my therapist at the time to sign it as a way to commit to behavior abstinence and recovery. But putting that much pressure on myself did not really serve me. The minute I broke that contract and acted on a behavior, I thought that I had failed, and my head was telling me that I might as well relapse because recovery was never meant for me. It took a while to get out of that lapse and attempt harm reduction, but I found myself always going back until I get threatened with inpatient treatment again. Then I end up giving in and taking the harm reduction approach again. And honestly, this has been happening for 9 years. Like I've mentioned, and I finally went back to treatment several months ago and just let myself be. I didn't have a deadline. I didn't have any expectations for myself. And even when I found that my treatment team was pushing me way too far in such a small amount of time, I decided to leave against medical advice, not because I had given up, not because I didn't want recovery, but because I really wanted recovery to be sustainable and to truly process everything in as much time as needed. And this is also because my past couple of relapses have not been about body image or food alone. The triggers have consistently been associated with systemic injustice, and so with everything happening right in front of our eyes right now, and I've felt so useless and have a lot of survivor's guilt, especially as an immigrant who just happened to be geographically lucky. And so that was also why I left treatment after I got medically stabilized, which I'm not encouraging at all. But in my case, I made sure that I was medically stable first because I knew that no treatment center will ever be able to address these injustices as much as I was passionate about them and as much as they affected my eating disorder. So it was always about body image, food, and control, and those weren't my biggest concerns anymore. So I needed more tailored treatment, which is what I'm currently doing, and it's been really impactful, and I'm learning and have a lot of coping skills now, and learning that, being in my eating disorder is not gonna give those who are unfortunate or geographically unlucky any more help. I'm not helping them by harming myself. And so just knowing that I really need to be on top of it and um, be engaged in recovery as much as I can is how I can actually advocate for other people. And that has been how my recovery has evolved the most. I think the biggest point, yeah.
Yeah, I love how you're illustrating the couple things. One, the trajectory of recovery from an eating disorder is rarely, if ever, this linear, I do this and then this happens, then everything's fine, regardless of whatever happens in life. That recovery is much more like a squiggly line that goes up and down and around and back and over and under and all of the things. And I think one of the things that I've learned is that both as a clinician and somebody who has had an eating disorder personally is that you really have to go through it. Like you don't, it doesn't work to go around, it doesn't work to go under, it doesn't all the things like the children's books. Like you got to go through it, and you need to go through it in a way that's sustained and tailored to meet your needs, and that can be highly individualized. And then I hear in your story this element that I hear in a lot of people's story, which is in order to be the most effective version of me that I want to be, in order to achieve the things I want to do, in order to contribute to the world in the way that I want to contribute, I need to be able to be, sort of the best kind of functional, equipped with coping skills me that I can be in order to do that, because I won't be of use to other people unless I can be of service and of use to me and I can take care of me, right? So it's a little bit like the put your own oxygen mask on before you help somebody else concept that really makes a lot of sense, right? It can feel wrong in the moment. Like, no, it's not about me. It's about all these other things or these other people or these other problems or these other things I want to do. And at the end of the day, in order to help anybody else, you need to have a solid ground to help from. And so I hear that in your story of like finding the pieces for you that help you to stay on your own particular recovery trajectory, however it works, wherever it goes, that are so key and can be hard because they can leave people feeling like, but I'm being selfish or I'm focusing too much on myself. And there's so many other ways I could be helping other people. And again, it is so critical to to get the help that we need for ourselves and to get the strong footing we need for ourselves so that we can then help other people. And I think that's really critical no matter what people want to do with their life from a career perspective or a service perspective. But I think for somebody like yourself that's really interested in being in the nutrition world and working with people with eating disorders, that's particularly important, right? If you are operating from a strong base and a strong grounding and a strong sense of self-care and what works well for you, which might be totally different than what works for someone else, right? That's the beauty of us being all of us being individual people, like what we need can be different, but that grounding is really critical. And I imagine that will continue to evolve you launch, into your finish this degree, into your next degree, into practice with folks with eating disorders. So I'm excited. I'm excited to talk to you in a couple of years and see how it's evolved, in a couple more years and see how it's evolved. Because I think the other thing that your story highlights for me is the degree to which treatment takes a while. It takes longer than most people ever want it to, right? That the idea that you can just go into a treatment center, whatever it is, whatever level of care for a relatively brief period of time and be like, all right, I'm good. I'm out. Like that just isn't, the eating disorder didn't happen overnight. It's not going to go away overnight. It does take that period of time to do all those things that we were talking about. And so I often will tell people, like obviously like don't give up, but also it really is, it takes a long time. And I'm sorry, again, if I could just wave my magic wand and disappear the eating disorder, I would do that. I would do a lot of other things too, but that concept, it just takes a while and it takes a lot of practice and it takes way longer and way more practice than anybody wants it to, right? That it just takes that perseverance. And on the plus side, a lot of people who struggle with an eating disorder have that genetic predisposition to persistence and can really like keep going and keep at it even when it's hard. And I can hear that in your story as well. So I think that's a plus, and sort of finding that, turning that trait or that predisposition towards the light instead of the dark is often how I talk about it. What what else do you hope for people, in the future, for people struggling with an eating disorder? What else would you like to see?
For the future, I really hope we move towards, like I said, a more inclusive and cultural responsible and responsive and accessible approach to eating disorders. I want to see treatment that truly recognizes that recovery doesn't look the same for everyone, not just in theory, but in actual practice. And I also hope that we start to see recovery in a less binary and more compassionate way. People deserve space to exist in the in between without being labeled as failing by people around them. Harm reduction, flexibility, meeting people in the middle where they're at should be seen as valid and life-saving, not as less than full recovery. I'd also love to see the field of nutrition and eating disorder treatment to expand beyond just the individual and really acknowledge the broader systems at play. And overall, I just hope people struggling with eating disorders feel less alone, that they can see themselves reflected in recovery spaces, that their experiences are validated, and that they're given the time, support, and autonomy to heal in a way that actually feels sustainable for them.
That sounds fantastic. So we ask everyone this last question. So a lot of times folks will be listening or will be talking to somebody in their life and say, "Oh, I heard this story where somebody, was pursuing recovery and had this experience and they're doing well, or they're achieving the things they want, or they're finding the things they want in life or being able to do the things they want, but that's never going to happen for me. It's just not going to happen for me." What would you say to that person?
Let me start by saying that I completely understand that feeling because I've been there so many times. And there were years where I genuinely believed recovery just wasn't meant for me. It felt like something that worked for other people, but not for my brain, not for my body, not for my life, not for everything I was carrying. And honestly, I'm not going to sit here and tell people that everything will magically click one day or that recovery is this perfect linear process because it's not. What I will say though is that recovery doesn't have to look like what you've been shown to be possible. It doesn't have to look like my recovery, it doesn't have to look like anyone else's recovery. In full recovery, if full recovery feels out of reach right now, that doesn't mean nothing is possible. There's so much space in the middle, like I've said. There's space for harm reduction, for small shifts, for questioning one thought, and for choosing one different behavior, for staying even when everything in you wants to leave. Those things matter and they do count. And I think a big turning point for me was realizing that I didn't have to believe in full recovery to start moving towards something better. Sometimes all you need is a tiny bit of willingness or even just curiosity about what life could feel like with a little less suffering or without that eating disorder. How you want to see your life in 20 years. Would you want to wake up and still count your calories? Would you want to wake up and count your blessings instead? And also, for recovery, as it's been presented to you doesn't feel possible, I'd really encourage you to ask, is it recovery itself that feels impossible or the version of recovery I've been given? Because those are two different things. And people deserve a version of healing that actually fits them, their culture, their experiences, their values, their reality. And even if it doesn't feel possible right now, that doesn't mean it always will feel that way, I promise.
Rawnaq, that's beautiful. We've been listening to Rawnaq Albathigi tell her story, share her wisdom, share her thoughts about the future of nutrition and eating disorder care. Thank you, Rawnaq, for sharing all of that with our audience. Where can people find you if they want to connect with you?
Yeah, they can find me on Instagram. It's just my name, Rawnaq_Albathigi, or in my LinkedIn, also the same, to connect. And I appreciate you for listening and for everyone else listening and for having me.
Excellent. Thank you. If you enjoyed today's episode of Piecemeal, please rate, subscribe, or leave a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Learn more about us at emilyprogram.com or find the Emily Program on social media. Piecemeal is produced by the amazing podcast team at the Emily Program. Until next time, take care. Thanks for listening.